Most people discover family at birth, but for a boy hiding beneath a silent Ferris wheel and a young woman just finishing her shift, family begins with a single choice: to protect. When 6-year-old Theo is found alone, afraid and unwilling to speak, no one expects his father to be one of the richest, most unreachable men in the world. But that night, something breaks, not just rules, but walls of grief, fear, and silence. How does a janitor become the only person a billionaire's son will trust? What happens when a child, a father, and a stranger begin to heal each other without saying a word? Stay with us until the end. This is the story of how silence can become language and how love can be chosen, not just inherited. Lara Menezes wasn't looking for anyone. She was simply walking out, end of shift, dragging behind her the chemical scent of detergent and sweat, the same blue uniform she wore every night, and the numb quiet that followed hours of cleaning up what others left behind. But as she passed the base of the Ferris wheel, her body stopped before her mind could. It was the shoes, small, motionless, just barely lit by the flickering park light above. She crouched automatically, more out of instinct than thought, letting her knees touch the cool concrete. The boy was maybe 6, bundled in a hoodie at least 2 sizes too big. He didn't speak, he didn't cry, he didn't even flinch when she asked softly, "Are you okay, honey?" Just wide, darting eyes, tracking the shadows beyond her shoulder. Lara didn't move closer. She knew that look. Instead, she sat right there beside the Ferris wheel's cold frame, pulled her half-empty water bottle from her bag, and twisted the cap. She offered it to him with an outstretched arm and a softness that made it clear this wasn't a demand. This was a choice. He didn't take the bottle, but he didn't run either. That to Lara was something. She let her hand rest lightly on the ground, bottle in her palm, and simply stayed. Every now and then she glanced at him, but never for long. The boy's posture wasn't exactly hiding. It was holding still, holding breath, holding everything in his tiny frame, like he was afraid even blinking might bring something crashing down. Lara didn't ask again. Instead, she pulled a lollipop from her pocket, an old habit she'd picked up from working near kids. She didn't wave it in his face or unwrap it, just placed it gently between them, then leaned back and looked up at the quiet steel of the wheel above. "I get scared sometimes too," she said, not looking at him. "Sometimes I sit still and wait for the noise to go away." The silence stretched long, the kind that would have been unbearable with anyone else, but with him it just settled. After 5 full minutes, his foot slid forward an inch and then another. She didn't move, didn't smile. She just adjusted slightly so her body formed a kind of curved edge in front of him, a small, silent offer of shelter. Time passed strangely, slow but sharp. Lara could tell he wasn't lost. Lost kids ask questions. They look for faces, for signs, for something familiar. This boy didn't. His gaze stayed low, avoiding light, movement, and especially the shadows near the park's gates. Lara watched him with the patience of someone who'd learned that pressing for answers doesn't bring them faster. When a pigeon startled nearby, his shoulders jumped, and she saw it. The breath he sucked in, the panic that clenched and twisted behind his ribs. Lara shifted slightly, making herself smaller, quieter. "No one's going to touch you," she whispered, not knowing where the words came from, but trusting them all the same. And slowly, like a thread being pulled from a knot, the boy moved, just enough to bring himself within arm's reach. He didn't look at her, but he let himself exist in her space. That was more than she expected. She didn't reach out, but something between them shifted, a thread caught, not broken. It wasn't long before the static of radios cracked through the night. Lara's eyes narrowed as the clicking grew closer. Too many footsteps, too fast, too loud. She instinctively turned slightly, blocking the boy with her body. He hadn't moved yet, but the muscles in his legs tensed like coiled springs. She raised a hand gently toward him without touching. "Stay," she whispered, soft but sure. His eyes locked on hers for the first time, truly locked, and she could see it, raw and terrifying. He was more afraid of being found than of being alone. Then the voices came, sharp and male. "There, behind the Ferris wheel!" Floodlights switched back on, beams of white slicing through the shadows, and the boy jolted. Without thinking, he pressed himself against her side, not for comfort, but for cover. Lara's uniform crinkled under his grip, his fingers tightening at her waist like he was bracing for something worse. Her heart thudded once, loud in her own ears, but she didn't flinch. She stood up slowly, keeping him shielded behind her. The security team was already advancing, 3 men in black jackets with radios at their chests and tension in their steps. One of them gestured at the boy like he was a package to be retrieved. "Miss, step aside. We need to verify—" Lara cut him off with nothing but a look. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She simply stayed still, her body between theirs and the child, who hadn't said a word. "He's not running," she said quietly, not daring to turn around. "But he's not going with you like this." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was tight, charged, filled with unsaid things that hung between uniforms and instinct. But no one pushed forward. No one laid a hand on her. And in that standoff, brief and small, Lara became something she never expected to be, a line no one crossed. Behind her, the boy didn't speak. He didn't move, but his small hand, still gripping the side of her shirt, relaxed just a little. His forehead leaned for barely a second into the back of her leg. It wasn't affection. It wasn't surrender. It was something else. Something like breath. A moment of borrowed safety. Lara didn't acknowledge it, didn't glance down. She just stood there, rooted in place, a 22-year-old janitor in a wrinkled uniform, guarding a silent child from people who thought finding him meant fixing everything. There were no headlines here, no miracles. Just a single wordless decision made in the margin of a forgotten hour. She stayed. And in that brief act, with one frightened boy behind her and authority in front of her, Lara Menezes became something else entirely. Not a savior, not a solution, but something smaller, quieter. She became a shelter. Graham Whittaker arrived like a headline you could touch. He didn't walk into the park so much as cut through it. Men in dark suits fanning out before him, radios pressed to their collars, phones lit up with silent instructions. The Ferris wheel's lights flickered on again, as if someone had flipped a switch just for his entrance. Lara, still crouched beside the boy, watched the small circle of executives and security around the billionaire. He was taller than she expected, not bulky but upright, like someone who had forgotten how to slump. His face was unreadable at first glance, carved from whatever people in glass towers are carved from, but there was a flicker when his eyes found the child. It wasn't anger. It wasn't relief either. It was something colder, the hesitation of a man unsure how to approach his own son. The boy didn't call out, didn't move. He shrank closer to Lara's side as the group approached, a silent decision that spoke louder than a cry. Graham's steps slowed, confusion flickering across his otherwise rehearsed expression. The first words came not from Graham, but from one of the men in black. "Mr. Whittaker, we've secured the area. The child is unharmed. We can proceed to—" He stopped mid-sentence when Graham raised a hand, not looking at him, but at the boy's white-knuckled grip on the cleaner's uniform. Lara felt the tension humming under the air like a live wire, but she didn't move. She could see the boy's face tilting slightly, his eyes scanning the circle of adults with a predator's wariness. He wasn't scared of Graham. He was scared of the whole machine that came with him. "Theo," Graham said finally, his voice lower than she expected, hoarse like a man out of practice. "I came as soon as I—" He broke off because Theo pressed his face harder against Lara's side. Graham blinked twice and swallowed, but his hands stayed down, palms visible. Lara noticed how deliberate the billionaire's movements were, as if he were approaching a wild animal instead of his own son. "It's all right," he added, more to himself than to Theo. "You're all right." Lara saw the other men glance at each other. "We're already trending," someone muttered. Another added, "We need to manage the optics. This isn't—" Graham cut him off with a look that made the man's throat close around the rest of his sentence. But his eyes returned to the boy almost instantly. Lara realized she was the only one kneeling, the only one at Theo's level. The executives and security were all standing, looming, their words clinical, clipped. She shifted slightly, placing her palm on the ground again. "He's not hurt," she said softly to Graham, though her voice was really aimed at the whole circle. "He just doesn't want to be rushed." Graham's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a wince she'd seen. "He used to run to me," he murmured, a confession that didn't seem meant for public ears. Lara glanced at him briefly. "Maybe he still will," she said, "but not if you surround him like this." It was a risk, speaking that way to a man whose name she only knew from headlines. But she saw something flicker in his eyes, gratitude or shame. She couldn't tell which. One of the executives stepped forward, voice polished with PR training. "Miss, your cooperation is appreciated. We need to extract the child and escort him safely. You may step aside." Lara's jaw clenched. Theo's fingers dug deeper into her shirt. "If you call him the child again in front of his father," she said quietly, "you're not helping anyone." A stunned silence followed, like air sucked out of a room. Graham inhaled slowly, eyes fixed on Lara now. "Who are you?" he asked, not hostile, just bewildered. "Nobody," she answered. "Just the one who happened to find him first." She reached into her cleaning cart behind her, pulled out a knitted sweater someone had left weeks ago in Lost and Found. She held it out toward Theo without looking at him. "You're cold," she murmured. He hesitated, then inched one hand out, still keeping the other clamped on her shirt. The sweater passed from her to him in a slow, fragile handoff. Theo drew it to his chest and didn't put it on yet, but he didn't let go of it either. Graham watched the exchange as though it were happening underwater. He took a half step closer, then stopped when Theo's eyes darted toward him. "I'm not going to force him," Graham said suddenly, addressing his own team more than Lara. "Not tonight." The men shifted uncomfortably. One opened his mouth to object, but Graham's glance silenced him before sound emerged. He crouched then, lowering himself for the first time to Theo's level. It wasn't graceful. His knees cracked audibly, and his jacket wrinkled in ways billionaires' jackets aren't supposed to. "Theo," he said, softer now, "I know you don't want all of this. I know." The boy didn't respond, but the grip on Lara's shirt loosened by a fraction. Graham saw it. His hands curled briefly into fists on his knees, then opened again. "You can stay with her a moment longer," he said, still crouched. "No one's taking you from her, I promise." Lara didn't move. Theo didn't move, but in the middle of the circle something imperceptible shifted. It wasn't trust yet, not even a truce. But the boy's breathing slowed. Graham exhaled once, a sound like glass cracking under pressure. For a man whose empire was built on data, prediction, and control, he looked completely, utterly lost in the simplest of tasks, reaching his own child. Lara realized he wasn't cold or cruel. He was fragile, transparent in a way that made his wealth look like a costume. The executives lingered, restless, their phones vibrating with unread notifications, but no one moved to break the tableau. Lara kept her gaze on Theo and slid the sweater fully over his shoulders now, adjusting it gently so it didn't bunch at the neck. It was the first action of the night that wasn't for a plan or a headline, but for a boy. Graham saw it, swallowed hard, and looked away for a moment, as if the sight itself was too sharp to hold. And there, in the strange stillness of the park, the billionaire and the janitor both did the same thing without speaking. They stayed exactly where they were. The folding table behind the carousel still smelled faintly of fried sugar and rain. Lara sat across from a woman in a tailored blazer who never once took off her Bluetooth headset, even while laying out the non-disclosure agreement between them like it was a menu. The pen handed to Lara was heavy and gold, and it didn't suit her fingers, still stained faintly blue from the cleaning fluid she'd used hours earlier. "You are agreeing to confidentiality regarding everything that occurs from this moment forward," the woman said, her voice clipped and distant, as if reciting from a script she'd read too many times. Lara nodded without asking for clarification. She hadn't needed lawyers to understand that whatever was happening here wasn't normal, not in the legal sense, not in the human sense. She signed, her name a little crooked, a little rushed. "You'll accompany us to the vehicle. The boy will be taken to a secure location, and Mr. Whitaker will consult with child development specialists," the woman continued, rising too quickly, already moving to rejoin the group near the exit. But Lara didn't stand. She raised a hand. "1 minute," she said. Not a question, a statement, a decision. She turned away from them, back toward the boy, who still hadn't moved more than a few feet from the Ferris wheel. His eyes were half-lidded now, not sleepy, but guarded, calculating. He didn't trust that things were done, even if the volume had lowered. Lara sat on the concrete ground without asking, folding her legs and pulling a napkin from her pocket. Not a fresh one she'd used earlier for a sandwich she never finished. From her bag, she grabbed a dull pencil, the kind kept for inventory notes, and began sketching. The circle she drew was imperfect, shaky, a child's drawing, but it was unmistakable, the Ferris wheel with its outer ring and central spokes. She slid the napkin across the ground toward him, slow, like offering a piece of herself. "This," she said quietly, "this is where we are." The boy blinked, lips slightly parted, his gaze fell to the circle. She didn't push, she didn't say anything else. After a moment he moved, not closer to her but forward, onto his knees. His small fingers reached for the pencil. She didn't exhale until he touched it. With quick, sharp movements, he added 3 jagged lines outside the circle, one above, one to the right, one to the lower left. His shoulders rose with each stroke, breath hitching in a rhythm that sounded more like panic than expression. Then he paused, staring at the napkin like it was a doorway he couldn't quite step through. Slowly, shakily, he added a word in the corner. The letters were awkward, crooked, B-A-R-U-L-H-O. Not in English. Lara's heart cracked a little, not from confusion, but recognition. He didn't lack language. He was drowning in it. "Barulho," she murmured aloud, tasting the syllables. Noise. She looked back at him, but his eyes were elsewhere again, darting like birds against the wind. Lara didn't correct the spelling, didn't ask for more. She folded the napkin gently, creasing it down the middle like it was something sacred. She didn't need a file or a briefing to know what mattered here. This wasn't just a drawing or a cry for help. It was a map of a child's mind, and he was giving it to her. The woman with the headset returned, arms crossed, unimpressed. "We need to go now," she said, glancing down at Lara like she was a misplaced piece of furniture. Lara stood slowly, dusting off her pants, tucking the folded napkin into her pocket like a compass. She didn't explain. She didn't offer commentary. The boy remained silent, but this time, when Lara took a step, he mirrored it. 1 foot, then another, always keeping her within reach, even if no hand was offered. Lara noted the way he checked behind him twice, not for danger, but for return. As if whatever trust he'd extended came with conditions, boundaries drawn in invisible ink. They walked slowly toward the path that would lead them to the cars, Lara always slightly between him and the others. The men didn't protest. Not this time. Graham watched from afar, hands in his pockets, face unreadable. His gaze didn't leave his son, but his body didn't move to claim him either. Perhaps he understood finally that approach had to be earned, not assumed. As they neared the vehicle, a sleek black car with tinted windows and engines too quiet, Lara glanced down at the folded note again. She touched the outline of it through her pocket. The texture was slightly damp, crinkled, like something alive. She didn't unfold it. She didn't need to. The boy stayed beside her, his hoodie slipping off one shoulder, sweater still gripped in his small hand. He glanced at her once, briefly, and then looked away. That was all, but it was enough. Behind them, the carousel lights dimmed once again, and the distant hum of closing time returned. But this time, she carried something more than silence, a thread, a line between two people who didn't know each other, but recognized the shape of fear. And in that fragile exchange of pencil and paper, something had shifted. Lara hadn't offered therapy or promises. She had offered a place, a still point inside the noise. She reached the car door but paused before entering. Something told her that rushing would shatter whatever tenuous thing had formed. She opened the door slowly and waited. The boy didn't need coaxing, only time. He climbed in after her, small legs folding carefully on the leather seat. The door shut with a hiss behind them. No one cheered, no one clapped. The woman with the clipboard marked something off, already shifting to the next logistical concern. Lara leaned back in her seat, finally allowing herself to exhale. She pressed her fingers to the edge of her coat pocket where the folded napkin rested. A simple sketch, a broken word, a clue. It wasn't a conversation, not yet. But it was a start, not a lack of voice, she realized. An overflow. Too much noise, too many demands, too many people reaching and grabbing without asking. She touched the paper once more. Then she let her hand fall into her lap and looked out the window as the car began to move. The folded note still tucked safely against her side, not discarded, not decoded, but held like a map she would someday learn to read. The apartment was vast and silent, but the only part that mattered to Theo was the hallway closet with the sliding doors that didn't quite shut all the way. The second they entered the penthouse, he disappeared from the group, unnoticed by everyone except Lara. While the adults spoke in hushed tones about schedules and staff coordination, Theo slipped into the master hallway and quietly pulled back the door of the linen closet. It was stocked neatly with folded white sheets and matching pillowcases, too perfect to feel used, too sterile to feel safe. Still, he climbed inside, knees tucked to chest, hoodie sleeves hiding most of his face. The linens were thick enough to muffle light, but not enough to block the faint sounds of adult negotiation coming from the open space behind him. He didn't cry. He didn't sleep. He simply compressed, like he always did when the world grew too large. This space was small, and small meant manageable. It meant quiet. But it didn't last long before someone found him, not with a flashlight or questions, but with a whisper. "Theo?" The voice was familiar. It didn't belong to the people who offered promises in rehearsed tones. It was Lara. She didn't open the closet all the way. She crouched down, careful not to block the small slit of air he'd left between the sliding doors. She spoke, gently. "Would it be all right if I made you a little fort?" Her tone wasn't playful but calm, like an adult speaking to another adult who just happened to be small. Theo didn't answer, but she didn't expect him to. She waited, still crouched, her knees already beginning to ache from the hard floor. A few minutes passed before the lightest nod came from inside the stack of linens. That was enough. Lara stood and walked toward the living room where Graham was speaking to a woman in a grey pencil skirt, likely the household manager. As soon as Lara began explaining the idea, the woman clicked her tongue. "We have procedures. No improvising with staff. The child has scheduled therapy intake." "Stop," Graham said, his voice low but final. He turned to Lara. "You want to build a fort?" She nodded. "He's hiding in a closet full of blankets. I think he's already halfway there." Graham paused, unreadable for a moment, then slowly nodded. "Let her." Back at the closet, Lara began pulling the linens out gently, not disrupting Theo's cocoon, but building around it. She arranged chairs and couch cushions, then draped the blankets across them, creating a covered corner just beside the closet opening. "It doesn't have to be perfect," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "Just needs to feel like yours." She added a flashlight inside and turned it on, placing it sideways so the beam illuminated the new walls without blinding him. Still, no words from Theo. No eye contact either. But when she stepped back, she saw his legs shift, cautiously, slowly, toward the edge of the closet, just barely entering the cabana space she'd made. That was his choice, his pace. She sat outside the edge of the structure, never facing him directly, but keeping her body nearby. Not looming, not retreating, just present. A steady kind of waiting. From the hallway, Graham watched silently. His expression remained hard to read, part caution, part awe, like he was watching something delicate unfold and didn't trust himself not to break it. After a few long minutes, Graham moved forward, steps quieter than usual. When he reached the edge of the cabana, he crouched down, clearly uncomfortable in the new posture, but determined. Lara glanced at him once, offering nothing but space. "Do you want to sit?" she asked. He nodded once, eyes fixed on the small gap where his son was barely visible. But instead of trying to crawl inside or speak directly to Theo, Graham simply sat outside the cabana, legs folded uncomfortably, jacket creasing at the shoulders. He looked like a man trying to learn a new language mid-sentence. Lara turned back slightly and said, "You don't have to say anything, just be here." Graham nodded, jaw tight, eyes rimmed with something he wasn't letting fall. They sat like that, two adults on the floor of a billionaire's apartment, in the shadow of a linen fort, and waited. No commands, no requests, just time. For once, no one in the room was trying to fix Theo. They were just letting him be. Time passed, measured only by the slight rustling of Theo's clothes as he shifted deeper into the pillow fort. He didn't speak, he didn't reach, but he didn't leave either. And in that, something softened in the air. Lara felt it first. The subtle unraveling of high-alert stillness, the kind children carry when they expect something to go wrong at any moment. Graham noticed it next. His posture changed, less stiff, more grounded. He leaned slightly forward, but not too much. Close enough to be there. Far enough not to take, Lara whispered, "Sometimes the best thing we can do is nothing." Graham didn't respond, but his lips pressed into a line that meant he'd heard her. The woman from earlier passed by the doorway, holding a tablet and mouthing something to Graham. He didn't answer her. He didn't look away from the fort. Whatever memo she had, it could wait. His son was inside a fabric shelter, somewhere between hiding and healing, and for the first time in what felt like years, Graham understood that this moment wasn't his to manage. It was Theo's to own. There were no breakthroughs that night, no emotional collapse, no words said aloud, just a cabana of blankets beside a closet, a boy curled up inside it, a father learning how not to intrude, and a janitor with no training but enough instinct to read what professionals had missed. They stayed like that, Lara seated with one leg stretched, Graham with his arms over his knees, and Theo barely visible but undeniably present. The room said nothing, but something important happened all the same. Not a victory, not a solution, just a pause in the storm. A silence that didn't mean absence but presence. Eventually, Lara leaned her head back against the wall, eyelids fluttering once before she reopened them. Graham didn't speak. He simply glanced at her, then looked back at the fort. And in that shared stillness, with no one trying to own the moment, they all managed the one thing they hadn't before, to remain. No demands, no directives, just presence. Three people, unevenly stitched together by circumstance, but held there, imperfect, quiet, and steady. No one moved. And that in itself was enough. It was nearly 3 in the morning when Lara's stomach reminded her she hadn't eaten anything real since noon. The hush in the apartment wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that followed too much tension, too many eyes, and too many choices made in low voices. She moved quietly, not to avoid waking anyone, but because she didn't want to disturb whatever delicate calm had finally settled in. The kitchen looked more like a lab than a place where anyone actually cooked. Chrome surfaces, temperature-controlled drawers, appliances that responded to touch like they were waiting for commands in binary. Still, hunger didn't wait for aesthetics, and neither did worry. She opened drawers until she found what she needed: a saucepan, a wooden spoon, a half-used container of broth, and a handful of small vegetables wrapped tightly in plastic, untouched like everything else in that place. She cut slowly, methodically, more for the rhythm than the recipe. The pot began to simmer. Steam rose. The scent of garlic and carrot lifted gently into the air, not demanding attention, just offering something warm. And that's when she heard it. Not footsteps, but the subtle shift of someone moving cautiously down the hall. Theo didn't announce himself. He simply appeared, small hands wrapped around the sleeves of his hoodie, bare feet nearly silent against the floor. Lara didn't turn around at first. She let him approach on his own terms, and when he did, it was only as far as the edge of the kitchen's marble island. His eyes flicked between the stove and the countertop, taking in the unfamiliar scene. "Hungry?" she asked quietly, still stirring. He didn't answer, but his posture shifted. Shoulders easing, arms unfolding just enough to let his fingers tap lightly against the side of the counter. That was his yes. Lara pulled out a mug, not a bowl, and poured the soup carefully, leaving room at the top. "It's better in mugs," she said. "You can hold it with both hands." She slid it toward him, but didn't watch him take it. Theo stared at it for a long moment before wrapping both hands around the ceramic. The warmth made his eyes close for a second, just long enough to see what safety felt like in something as simple as heat and timing. From the hallway behind them, footsteps approached. Not hurried, not invasive. Graham entered the kitchen with the caution of someone approaching something he wasn't sure he was welcome in. His tie was gone, shirt sleeves rolled to the forearms, and the look on his face wasn't rehearsed or powerful, just tired. When he saw Theo at the counter, holding the mug with both hands like it was something fragile, he froze. It wasn't the boy's presence that stunned him. It was how natural it looked, how uncurated, the type of moment his team would kill to stage for press photos, and yet it was unfolding in real time, without lights or scripts. Graham moved a step closer, eyes meeting Lara's briefly. He didn't speak. He didn't want to break the moment. Lara, sensing what was about to happen, turned slightly and saw the household photographer, or whatever title he had, creeping into the room with a phone raised. She didn't yell. She didn't scold. She simply walked over and pressed her fingers against the top of the phone, tilting it down, the screen going black. No drama, just a firm, quiet refusal. The man backed away without a word. Theo had seen it. He was watching. He didn't say thank you, but the way he glanced at her, then looked down again, told Lara everything. He had seen the way she'd shielded him without spectacle. She returned to her spot behind the counter, refilled the pot with a little more broth, and stirred again, giving them both something to look at that wasn't each other. Graham stepped forward now, slower, more tentative, as though entering someone else's home. He rested one hand gently on the edge of the island and waited. Theo didn't look at him, but he didn't retreat either. There was a kind of quiet understanding now. Not trust, but an absence of fear. Lara slid another mug toward the stove and looked at Graham. "He already gave you permission to be here," she said, not unkindly. "You just need to notice when he does." Graham's brow furrowed, not in anger, but in confusion. "How?" he asked, voice low. Lara gestured with her chin. "Start with the fact that he didn't walk away. Graham exhaled slowly and said nothing more, letting that sink in. It was the first time he'd been given an instruction he didn't feel the need to correct. Theo didn't speak, but as the silence grew deeper, it shifted, no longer tense but quiet in a different way. He lowered the mug just slightly, enough to reach toward the drawer beside him, where the silverware had been laid out in neat, untouched rows. He took a spoon for himself, then paused. His hand hovered a moment before pulling out a second spoon, his fingers wrapped around it tightly. Then, without looking up, he placed it gently on the counter between them and nudged it toward Graham. The gesture was so small, so easy to miss, and yet it rang louder than any word spoken that night. Graham didn't react right away. He just stared at it, that second spoon, gleaming under the kitchen light like an invitation left unsigned. Lara's eyes flicked from Theo to Graham, gauging whether the father would see what had just happened, and he did. Not in the loud, dramatic way of someone making a breakthrough, but in the quiet recognition of something rare, an opening. Graham stepped forward without speaking and accepted the spoon, fingers brushing the countertop where Theo's hand had been moments before. He didn't make a speech. He didn't reach out. He simply lifted the mug Lara had prepared for him and stood there, sipping slowly, eyes focused on the boy who was no longer hiding. In the reflection of the glass cabinet above the sink, he saw himself, not the tycoon, not the widower, but a man simply trying not to fail at something that mattered more than every company he'd ever built. Lara remained where she was, leaning slightly against the counter, watching them both. She didn't smile, she didn't cry. She let the moment be what it was, fragile, imperfect, quietly enormous. The soup continued to simmer behind her, scent filling the space between them. And the boy, without a single word, had made a decision. Not a declaration, just a gesture. He took one more sip from his mug, looked at nothing in particular, and placed the second spoon gently by the edge of the counter, not in front of himself, but angled toward Graham. A silent offering, a seat at something they hadn't named yet, an invitation, simple and sacred. Lara didn't expect him to say yes. When she asked, softly, privately, if they could return to the park, just the three of them, she knew she was asking for something beyond schedule, beyond protocol. She knew how men like Graham Whitaker lived inside calendars and permission slips signed in triplicate, but she asked anyway. No drones, no press, no handlers in polo shirts, she said. Just you, him, and me. The head of security started to interject, something about operational risk, late-night hours, permits, but Graham raised one hand, just one, and everything stopped. That gesture had more weight than any argument, and Lara could see it, the difference between authority and intention. He didn't say yes right away. He just looked at her, then looked toward the hallway where Theo had been playing with the edge of a cardboard box. After a long pause, he said, "We'll need a key." And that was that. No fanfare. No negotiation. They left in a quiet car just past midnight, without the usual swarm of people whose job was to anticipate disasters before they happened. Tonight, they didn't need people to prevent something. They needed space to allow something. The park was empty, silent in a way it hadn't been the night they first found Theo. The lights were off, except for the ones Graham turned on with a switch on his personal console. The same one used for opening the park, after hours for inspections or private walkthroughs. Lara stepped out of the car first, not because anyone told her to, but because she knew Theo wouldn't move, unless he saw someone he recognized doing it first. She walked slowly toward the Ferris wheel, her steps calm, deliberate. Theo followed, close, but not clinging. Graham stayed a step behind them both. He wasn't being distant. He was being careful, the kind of careful that comes from trying not to ruin something you don't yet understand. When they reached the base of the wheel, Lara crouched next to the booth and looked up. "Can we ride it?" she asked. Graham nodded once. "Manually, I'll keep it slow." Lara didn't ask how he knew how to operate it. She assumed owning the park had given him privileges most people never saw. The motor clicked on with a low hum. One cart descended. They climbed in together. First Lara, then Theo, and finally, after a long pause, Graham. The ride moved slowly, more a glide than a spin. It was silent between them, but not uncomfortable. Theo sat between the two adults, his knees pulled up slightly, hands resting on his lap. He didn't fidget. He watched. First Lara's hands, calm in her lap. Then Graham's posture, tall but folded slightly forward, elbows on knees. The view began to change. Buildings shrank. The world widened. When they reached the top, the ride stopped, not abruptly, but with a soft, practiced stillness. Below them, the city pulsed in dim, late-night rhythm. Lights blinked in clusters, roads curved like rivers of static, but none of them were looking at the city. They were looking inward. The silence held, and then, without prompting, Theo raised one hand and pointed downward to a corner near the Ferris wheel's base. "Barulho," he said, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. Not loud, not firm, just there. A word. His first, spoken since the park. Lara didn't react visibly, but her throat tightened. Graham turned toward him slightly, but didn't speak. He knew better now. You don't respond to a miracle by clapping, you respond by listening. Lara reached gently into the pocket of her jacket, the one she'd been wearing that night. She still hadn't washed it. Some things you don't disturb until they're ready. She pulled out the folded napkin, the same one with the circle and the jagged lines. She didn't open it. She just held it, fingers curling around the soft, worn edges. She offered it to Theo without words. His fingers brushed hers as he took it, carefully, reverently. He opened it on his lap, tracing the lines he himself had drawn days ago. Then he did something new. He reached for the pencil Lara had tucked behind her ear, a habit from long shifts. She passed it to him. Theo leaned over the napkin and, with small, deliberate strokes, added a single word beside the jagged lines. Chega. His handwriting was still messy, uncertain, but clear enough to be read. Lara's eyes didn't leave the napkin. She knew what that meant. "Enough," she whispered. Not a complaint, a choice, a closing of something. Graham watched him write it. His hands slowly closed over his knees. No cameras, no handlers, no applause. Just a 6-year-old boy deciding finally to draw a limit. The wind brushed through the open cart, soft against their faces. Graham looked down, then closed his eyes for a moment. Not to hide, to feel. "He's not broken," Lara said quietly, still watching the napkin. "He's overloaded." Graham didn't answer, not right away. His eyes opened slowly, not with the sharpness of a CEO about to give a verdict, but with the weariness of a man beginning to understand the cost of his own absence. "I thought silence meant damage," he said eventually, "but now I think it was the only way he could stay intact." Lara nodded, gently taking the napkin back as Theo let it go. She folded it again, smaller this time, tighter, not hiding it, just protecting it. Theo leaned lightly against her side. It was brief, barely a moment, but it was contact. Graham noticed. He didn't speak, he didn't move. His head dipped forward a little, and for the first time he looked smaller than the seat he sat in, like a father rather than a figure. No one told him how to feel. He found it on his own. As the wheel began its slow descent, Graham reached forward and tapped the control panel lightly, letting the ride lower them back toward the ground. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Something important had happened. Not loud, not staged, just necessary. Theo didn't withdraw. He stayed beside Lara, hands still in his lap, feet swinging slightly now. When they touched solid ground, Graham didn't rush to be the first out. He waited, and when Theo finally stepped down, Graham followed behind him, matching his pace. Lara walked beside the boy, the folded napkin back in her pocket. The ride slowed to a halt behind them, the wheel now empty but somehow fuller than it had ever been. They didn't turn back, didn't take photos. They walked away from the Ferris wheel, not as strangers forced together by circumstance, but as three people who had, for one suspended moment, existed in complete stillness. Graham lowered his head as they neared the car. He didn't say it aloud, but he understood now. Paternity wasn't about building empires or protecting legacies. Sometimes it was about stopping the world just long enough to hear one small voice say, "Enough." The meeting began the way these meetings always did. Too early, too prepared, too far removed from anything that actually mattered. Graham sat at the head of the long glass table, untouched coffee cooling beside his elbow. Across from him were four members of his executive crisis team, each with tablets in hand and a new folder labeled Reputation Strategy, Child Recovery Protocol, resting on the table like a contract waiting for blood. The head of security was the first to speak, voice confident, too loud for the room. "We're recommending a temporary separation between the employee and the child. Therapeutic boundaries are essential. It will show the public that we're approaching this with clinical caution." Lara was not in the room. She hadn't been invited to this one. Graham didn't react, not yet. The woman from PR leaned forward next. "We've prepared a timeline for controlled disclosure, a photo release followed by an official statement. We highlight the father's presence, his effort, the recovery journey." She smiled, a rehearsed, press-friendly smile. "We control the narrative." Graham stared at the folder in front of him, fingers still. His silence was not approval. It was the kind that signaled something was about to snap. They didn't notice the shift, not right away. People like them rarely did. They were trained to read charts, not rooms. The next executive pushed forward a color-coded graph. "Public sympathy is up since last night. We've modeled that sustained engagement with the child could elevate brand sentiment by up to..." Graham stood, not abruptly, slowly, deliberately. He reached forward and picked up the top document from the folder, flipping it once in his hands, then holding it upright. His fingers gripped the top edge, his thumb bracing the bottom, and then he tore it, right down the middle, clean, firm, final. The room fell silent, not out of shock, but confusion, like a system failing to register an error code it wasn't programmed for. "He's not a campaign," Graham said, eyes cold and clear. "He's not a photo opportunity. He's not a bullet point in a quarterly report." One of the men opened his mouth to respond, a protest, a defense, something reflexive. But Graham cut him off with a look. The kind of look that only a man with nothing left to prove can deliver. "The narrative is his," he said, and turned slightly, gesturing toward the corner of the room where Theo sat quietly on a couch, tablet on his lap, drawing concentric circles over and over. No one had noticed him there. That was the point. He had come into the room holding Lara's hand, quietly, and had settled into the background like a ghost, visible only to the people who chose to see. He hadn't spoken. He didn't look up. He just drew. Layer upon layer of looping lines, not in chaos, but in method. Graham walked over, crouched beside him, and watched for a few seconds. "What are you drawing?" he asked. Theo didn't answer. But after a moment, he tilted the tablet slightly toward his father, just enough for Graham to glimpse the pattern. It wasn't abstract. It was the Ferris wheel. Dozens of them, overlapping, like the memory had been replaying in his head non-stop. Graham nodded once. "Okay," he whispered. Then he stood, turned back to the table, and began speaking clearly. "Effective immediately. We're cutting the child-related PR budget by 90%. Cancel the soft launch campaign. We don't need a public arc. What we need is to stop pretending this is a strategy meeting." The PR lead blinked in confusion. "But Graham, the market will recover," he replied flatly. "He won't. Not if we turn him into an exhibit. The head of security, the same man who had once issued Lara orders as though she were a liability, cleared his throat and leaned in. "You're emotional," he said carefully, "which is understandable. But this is about safeguarding future risk." Graham turned to face him. "No," he said, voice low and firm. "This is about safeguarding a boy who doesn't trust people in suits barking strategy around his name." He looked toward the door. "Bring me Lara." The silence in the room shifted again, not just quiet but uncertain. A few seconds later, Lara entered, cautious, eyes scanning the table before settling on Theo. She didn't move to him, just stood, waiting. "You're staying," Graham told her, "not because it looks good, not because I need your help managing him, but because he already chose you before he remembered how to choose anyone else." Lara didn't speak at first. She just looked at Graham, eyes searching his for any trace of performance. She found none. "And what am I now?" she asked quietly. "A tool, a bridge, a stand-in mother?" Graham shook his head. "You're a human being who did the one thing the rest of us forgot how to do. You listened." There was no applause, no nods of approval, just the sound of a door opening as the head of security left the room, defeated but silent. The PR lead followed shortly after, tapping furiously at her phone. The others remained frozen, unsure of how to proceed in a meeting where the usual script had been thrown out. Graham didn't sit again. He walked to the window, looked out at the city, and let his shoulders fall. Not with weakness, but release. Behind him, Lara crossed the room and sat beside Theo. She didn't ask what he was drawing. She didn't try to analyze the meaning of the circles. She just sat, quiet, present. Her presence didn't demand attention. It held it, gently. Graham watched from a distance as Theo leaned slightly toward her shoulder, tablet still in his lap. He didn't need her to say anything. He just needed her nearby. That was the part no protocol could teach, no guideline could anticipate. Graham turned back to them, his posture softer now. "The team's reduced to 5, he said simply. "Essential only. No cameras, no scripting, just care." No one dared contradict him anymore. He had spoken as a father, not a founder. Lara nodded slowly. "All right," she said, "but only if you mean it." Graham met her eyes. "I do." The guilt was still there, etched in the lines around his mouth, in the quiet way he moved. But it no longer controlled him. It had lost its power to dictate. Theo shifted again on the couch, his small finger drawing another loop, this time less tight, less clenched. The room, once thick with the weight of management, now felt cleared out, not just physically but in energy. As if finally someone had stopped building fences around the boy's silence and started giving him space to breathe. Graham stepped back once more, looked at the shredded protocol still lying on the table, and didn't pick it up. Some things, once broken, are better left unrepaired. They returned to the park not as they had before. Not in a panic, not under floodlights, not wrapped in protocols. This time, it was morning. The gates opened not because someone forced them, but because Graham unlocked them himself, quietly, without ceremony. The city was already awake, humming with traffic and life, but inside the park things moved slower. Lara carried a small backpack, slung over one shoulder, and in her hands a simple, spiral-bound notebook, blank except for one page with a folded corner. Theo walked beside her, not behind, and didn't need to be nudged forward. Graham followed, holding something that looked oddly out of place in his hands. The same knitted sweater Theo had worn that first night. It had been cleaned, repaired along the seams, but he held it like something fragile, something priceless. No cameras followed. No advisors gave stage directions. It was just them. And when they reached the Ferris wheel, Lara turned to the boy and crouched to meet his eyes. "One more ride?" she asked. Theo looked up, then sideways at Graham, and nodded. They didn't run. They walked and boarded the same cart the same way, but this time with different hearts. The Ferris wheel moved slowly again, just as it had that night, but nothing about this ride was heavy. Theo sat between them again, but with his body more open, his back not curled inward, his hands resting calmly on the bar. In his lap, Lara placed the notebook and a pen, gently, as if offering a mirror he could draw himself into. "For when the noise gets loud again," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "You can write in here. Anything. Doesn't have to make sense. It just has to be yours." Theo looked down at the notebook, tracing the edge of the page with his finger, then uncapped the pen. He hesitated for several seconds, not from fear, but from weight. And then, slowly, carefully, he began to write. The letters were uneven, slightly crooked, but confident. T-H-E-O. He looked up at Lara briefly, as if to check if that was enough. She nodded, smiling faintly. Then his gaze moved to Graham, who sat still, sweater now resting in his lap, his eyes not glossy but full. Theo turned back to the notebook and added the next word, W-H-I-T-A-K-E-R. The weight of that name hung between them, not like a rope, but like a branch extended. Graham didn't speak. He didn't need to. The boy had just handed him something no headline could fabricate. Recognition, and not just of blood, but of space, of belonging. Theo sat with the pen poised again, unsure, fingers tapping against the spiral binding. He looked from Lara to Graham again, then back at the page. For a second, he did nothing. Then, deliberately, he drew a line through Whitaker. Not in anger, not rejection, just a quiet contemplative slash. Graham watched it happen, and surprisingly, he didn't flinch. His mouth twitched at the corner, the way it does when someone knows the point isn't to win, but to witness. Theo sat back, chewed the inside of his cheek, then started again beneath the crossed-out word. M-E-N-E-Z-E-S. The letters were bigger this time, spaced carefully, like he was planting something instead of spelling. He put the pen down, looked at Lara, looked back at the page, then smiled, small and lopsided, like someone realizing he didn't have to choose one world or the other. He could name both. There was no declaration, no sudden embrace, just silence, the good kind, the kind that holds meaning instead of avoiding it. Lara leaned back slightly, not to distance herself, but to breathe, to let it settle. Theo closed the notebook, held it against his chest, and looked down at the shrinking world beneath the Ferris wheel. Graham exhaled slowly beside him, one hand resting gently on the back of the bench, not quite touching the boy, but near enough that it could be reached if needed. "You spelled it right," Lara said softly. Theo looked at her and nodded as if he'd known that already. Graham, still holding the sweater, finally spoke. "You don't have to wear it again," he said. I thought maybe you'd want it nearby." Theo looked at the sweater, then reached out, touched it, and moved it closer to himself without putting it on. That was his answer. The sweater wasn't a shield anymore. It was a memory, and memories could be kept without being worn. As the Ferris wheel descended, they didn't rush. There was no urgency to end the ride, no need to prepare for the return to whatever came next. What had needed to happen had happened up there, not with signatures, not with lawyers, not even with clear decisions, but with choice. Theo had named himself, and in doing so he had named them, not as roles, not as father or caretaker, but as people who belonged to him, and to whom he could belong back. When the cart touched the ground, they waited until it stilled completely. Then Lara stepped out first, her hand brushing Theo's back gently. He followed her, notebook hugged to his chest, and Graham followed last, still holding the sweater. They walked away from the ride together. Three people without rehearsed smiles, without matching clothes, without shared last names on paper, but something deeper between them now. Lara didn't say anything. She just kept pace with Theo, who looked over at her and handed her the notebook. "Can you keep it for me?" he asked. "Only if I can read it when you let me," she replied. He nodded. A contract sealed without a stamp. No one watching would have called it a family. There were no legal documents signed that day, no photographers, no speeches. But in that quiet walk away from the Ferris wheel, something real had taken root. Graham reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded form, an adoption request he'd been carrying around for days, unsigned. He didn't give it to Theo. He didn't give it to Lara. He just held it for a second, then tucked it back in his coat, knowing the paper didn't matter half as much as what had already happened. Lara took Theo's hand and he let her. Not out of fear, not out of habit, but because he wanted to. Graham walked beside them, not ahead, not behind. And as they left the park, not as a rescue mission, but as a beginning, the fear that once ruled their every move no longer whispered at their heels. It had lost its throne. In the notebook, nestled between circles and uneven letters, a new story had started, one with no template, no roadmap. Just a name written in full, and from that a family began, not loudly, not perfectly, but undeniably. We put our hearts into every story we bring here. Behind each scene, every line, and every silent moment, there's time, care, and a deep desire to connect with you. If this story touched you in any way, subscribing to our channel is one of the best ways to help us continue. It's not just about numbers. It's about knowing you're with us, walking this journey of emotion and meaning together. Leave us a comment. What did this story spark in you? And if you haven't yet, take a look at our other videos. Every story here was made for you, with you in mind. Thank you for being part of this with us.